get you one and you still need one, I also have some. Fantastic. All right, as he's handing those out, if you missed any of the weeks and you're like, I wanted that handout, they're in here. I printed them out. There's like 5 of each. If I need more than that, let me know. So for the most part, they are in the section that says extra lessons. So I think 1 through 3 is on the front side, and then 4 and 5 are on the back. I have a lot of 5. I can't see 4, though. What'd I do with 4? Yeah, so technically today is 6, and I accidentally wrote 5. It is a misprint. So when we go to edit it, it will say 6. But that said, as this goes around, if you need old lessons, you can get them from the book. It's in the extra lesson folder. In the meantime, I will go ahead and pass that around. I don't know if there's a pen in there. I'm going to go ahead and hand you this one. All right, we're going to start the microphone at the back today, and we'll come up from the back. Well, we're going to go ahead and get moving. There may be some people still filing in. If you come in and you need more papers, there are papers in the back next to the sound booth. Feel free to grab one from down there if you need one. All right. So my hope today with getting into the section that is on Kings is that we would be able to get all the way from, opening into a monarchy, the first King Saul, and the second King David. That did not happen. By the time I got through, who Samuel is, and Saul, and introducing David, and David during the life of Saul, I didn't have any more time. It's already over 6 pages. It's like on 6 pages already. So I did not get to do like the king side of David. So next week we will try to aim for David and Solomon. Something I wanted to note, it's not in here. No, it is in here. It is in here. We'll talk about it when we get there, I guess. All right, so we finally made it to the Kings section. We have the United Monarchy, which we'll do for 2 weeks, and then we will go to the Divided Monarchy, which we will do for probably 2 weeks, and then we'll do Exile and the Temple. And if I have an extra week, maybe we'll extend one of those. I will try to make it so it's doable, so if this class ever gets redone, they can do it in 11 weeks. But if we have extra time, I'd love to add some extra things in, maybe in a last week of things that are honorable mentions that I wish we could have talked about. Honorable mentions. Maybe that'll be week 12. All right. As should be obvious, because we are very briefly going over 39 Old Testament books, you will not get all the details for anything. You could make an entire year-long series out of any of the books that we've already been through, or longer. I think Pastor's been in John and Luke and Matthew for who knows how many years, depending on which book it's in. And so he's done each of those at some point or another, and I think they were all multiple years. So it doesn't take a whole lot of work to make these multiple years. That said, we are going over in flyby mode. So as we get started today, as modern Americans, we tend to dislike monarchies. Yep. Ask Britain. We also, in general, are not as big of fans of poetry as we used to be. Poetry is not a big thing for us anymore. Now, if you are the exception to that rule, I'm proud of you, but you are the exception. This, however, this time of kings, this time of monarchy, is one of the most exciting and successful times in Israel's history. It happened to be the time of great stabilization, a consolidation of power, of growth, peace, and a vast majority of the poetical books were written during this time. You have to understand, there are probably over 70 Psalms that are attributed to David. That's approximately half the book of Psalms. And even on the other side of that, you've got people like Asaph and some of these other characters that would have lived during the time of Solomon and some of these other people who potentially showed the great ability to get into poetry and literature. And, if you're into Solomon got into zoology and all kinds of other things. And when you have this great time of peace, you can start learning and really expanding the culture of the group. And that's really what you see during this time. The culture of the Israelites explodes. Of the books of poetry, you have Job, which would have been a very early book, like we talked about. It would have been in the time probably of Abraham. Some people think late Genesis, but either way, I don't think that's very fitting. You've got Psalms, who, like I said, David wrote a bunch of. Proverbs, who Solomon wrote the vast majority of. Some people make an argument that some of the later Psalms were written by someone else, but we could talk about that later. And then you also have Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. So again, you've got all these books written during this time of this united monarchy. So it was a great time of this culture. So as we look today, my hope was to cover all of 1st and 2nd Samuel. That did not happen. We're going to get through 1st Samuel. And so next week we will go for 2nd Samuel, and I'll maybe pull in some things from Chronicles here and there. If you're familiar with the way that Chronicles, Kings, and Samuel works, 1st and 2nd Samuel is 1st Chronicles, essentially. 1st and 2nd Kings is 2nd Chronicles, essentially. The difference is Chronicles has like a priestly view in mind, and so they go back and they try to look for it, talking about the greatness of the Davidic line and the priests, if that makes sense. And so they really highlight that in Chronicles. So you'll see that if you ever are trying to look for why do I get these same stories 2 or 3 times. That's why. Anyway, as we go in, yes, ma'am. Are there any more papers back there, Tom? Can you bring a couple of those up to me? Oh, Michael's going to do it. He's the man. Does anybody else need a paper while we're here? Several. Go ahead, Michael. Make your rounds. He's at the back. I'll make sure I get him. And then Laverne needs one up here too, please. We have more in the back. We're not running low. It's just some people came in after we passed them out.
Thank you.
All right. Do you want me just to hold those? Or do you want to do it?
I can do it.
You got it. You're the man. All right. So we're going to look in today 1st and 2nd Samuel, depending on which version of the Old Testament you would have read it out of, whether it was the Septuagint or the Masoretic or all these things. They would have called this book by different names. At some point it was just the book of Samuel. It was one book. At some points it was 1st and 2nd Samuel. At one point it was 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, and then Kings became 3rd and 4th Kingdoms. And you can kind of look at these different names they've had in the past. But this book is written by an unknown author in hopes of not missing this pivotal time in the history of Israel. So we want to first look at the rise of the prophet and the sin of Israel. The rise of the prophet and the sin of Israel. So this is just 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 9. One of the things we're going to see is barrenness and fruitfulness. Hannah is on the scene in chapter 1. She is the barren wife of Elkanah, who seems to have been from the tribe of Levi. Now, there are some arguments about this. They're like, oh, it says Ephraimite or these other things. But somewhere in Chronicles, it talks about how he was a Levite, which is why he kind of ran the priestly role and did some of these things. There are arguments about that. I would argue Samuel was a Levite, and we can go through the argument for that if you'd like to. But what you'll see is there's this interesting topic that's brought up at the very beginning. It's just this guy, Elkanah, who you never see again, his wife Hannah, and he's got another wife. So bad plan there, by the way. 2 wives, not a good plan. And what you notice is anytime someone has 2 wives in the Bible, it always spells out trouble for one or both or the whole family. And you see that with Abraham, you see that with Jacob, you see that all over the place. And it's the same here. Although Elkanah loved Hannah and took very good care of her, his other wife recognized that love and decided she would put her down for her inability to have children. And it becomes a competition often when they have these multiple wives. Who does he love the most? Well, who can bear him the most kids? Well, who can... And it really, they kind of fight it out that way. And in a lot of cases, you have one wife who begins barren. Now, it's important that we see this, and I think I have it somewhere later. God has a care for those that are barren. That is a very difficult thing. If you've ever known somebody who could not have kids, it is a huge struggle, and especially in their time, they viewed it as a judgment of God. So as we're looking at this, somebody read 1 Samuel 1:10 and 11 for us, please.
And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. And she vowed a vow, and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but wilt give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head.
All right, so Hannah is sore vexed. She's very sad. She's got bitterness of soul. She's making a heartfelt plea to God that he would give her a child. And she basically says, God, if you'll give me this child, I will give him back to you, and I will essentially make him a Nazirite. Now, this is kind of nice, because I don't know if you remember the last Nazirite we talked about. His name was Samson, and that guy was a mess, okay? If you're not familiar with Samson, go back and read Judges 13 to 16. So Samuel, seeing this, just sees her like she's knelt down, she's weeping, she's just moving her mouth. He thinks she's drunk. And Samuel kind of gets onto her. He's like, when will you leave the wine? Like, get up and don't do that here in God's place. Like, what are you doing? And she basically tells him, no, that's not what I was doing. I wasn't trying to, drink my sorrows away. I'm coming to God and asking for his help. Just a special note here, and I kind of touched on this a little bit. God has an affinity to show the beauty and joy of having children. And a lot of times when someone starts off barren and then has a kid, God specially chose those people into the world by people who couldn't have children. So think about like what happened with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah was barren until she was 90 years old. Think about what happened here with Hannah. Think about what happened with Elizabeth in the New Testament, who bore John the Baptist. Sometimes God waits for a long time before he opens the womb of these people. Now, I don't know how many married women are up to, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. I doubt too many of you are saying, God, please let me have a child right now. And who knows, he might do it. but I don't think anybody's asking for it.
Not even in your 40s.
All right. Throwing it out there. That said, if it happens, remember, they're a blessing. You only want to choke them sometimes. All right. Anyway, so she eventually did have Samuel. So Eli, said, you know what? May God bless you in this. She eventually did have Samuel, whom she gave back to the Lord after he'd been weaned and left him in the care of Eli the priest. So then, after that, after we understand this story of where Samuel comes from, we really need to look at Eli, Samuel, and the tabernacle. So Eli had 2 sons, and they were very wicked. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas, or Phinehas, or however you want to say his name. They did a lot of things that were pretty sketchy. So they took people's sacrifices in wrong ways. So what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to swing this meat hook over after the flesh was charred, pull it off, drop it into a bucket, and that was supposed to be their portion. Instead, they took the sacrifice before it was burned. They said, no, we want fresh meat. We don't want sodden meat. We don't want these things. And so they tried to take people's sacrifices wrongly, and they said, and if you refuse, we'll take it from you by force. So they threatened people with violence. And even over and above that, the Bible says that they committed adulterous behavior with the women of the tabernacle. So the women who would hang out there, they went and they would have sexual relations with them when they should not have been. And at the very least, I believe Phinehas is married. I don't know about Hophni. So not a good setup. These are not very good priests. They're not who the people are supposed to be. So Samuel then is pictured next to them in contrast. So you have Hophni and Phinehas, and you have them living out in really wicked ways. And then 1 Samuel 2:12 says, is the red light on the microphone?
Now it is.
There you go.
Now the sons of Eli were the sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord.
Okay, so you see that. That's who the sons of Eli were. They didn't know God. And if you see it say the sons of Belial, that's essentially what they meant. It means they were wicked and they didn't serve God. And then 1 Samuel 2:26, it shows Samuel instead.
And the child Samuel grew on and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men.
Ooh, does that sound like anything you recognize from the New Testament? Somebody open their Bible up to Luke 2:52. I didn't write it down here, but just for fun. Sword drill. Who's got it first? Ready? Raise your hand. 3, 2. Oh, Chris, you work here. You don't count. Try again. Who else got it? Luke 2:52. All right, I see one. Go ahead. Read it as loud as you can. I know you don't have the microphone.
And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men.
Oh, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and with man. And so in the same way that Samuel grew up being a chosen person for God, you see almost that same statement about Samuel is later applied to Jesus. It's a beautiful thing. So God judged these men for their wickedness. Not just Phinehas and Hophni, but also Eli. I think this is important to note. They were wicked, but Eli also did not deal with his children's sins. 1 Samuel 3:13.
For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not.
So it's not just what the kids did, but as a parent, have you restrained your kids from that wickedness? It's interesting that God will judge the parents on what the kids do. And these would have been grown kids. This wasn't just, teenagers. Frankly, you couldn't serve in the priest office till you were how old? Anybody? 30. You couldn't serve in the priest office until you were 30. You could start maybe doing some under priest stuff at like 25-ish. They'd start kind of bringing you in so you see it. But at about 30 is when you officially were a priest. And so this is not a good setup. And so it's interesting to note that, because sometimes we think, well, once the kid is 18, he's not my fault, not my problem. The state's the problem. Well, God still looks at it and say, well, what did you do? Did you restrain them? Did you do this? So it's important things to think about. As Eli was getting older, God began calling to Samuel. Eli and Samuel misunderstood this 3 times. If you're familiar with the way this worked, it's the middle of the night. Samuel hears a voice, and he said, "You called me?" And Eli's like, "I didn't call you. Leave me alone." And he says, "Go to bed." And so he does it again, and then he hears it again, and he says, "Did you call me?" And Eli's like, "Get out of my face. I'm trying to sleep." That is the Alex Martin version of events. All right, and so he goes one more time, and he says, "Did you call me?" And this time he says, "All right, God's doing something here, because I'm not calling you and you're definitely hearing something." So he said, the next time you hear someone call you, say, "Lord, your servant listens. Your servant hears you." And this is a very, very important moment, because this is when Eli realized that Samuel was going to be a seer or a prophet. And the Bible says at this time there was no open word from the Lord. This was not something they had access to. They did not really have a prophet that went around telling people what God had on his mind and what he expected and things like that. They had the law. They had the priests that were supposed to publish the law and help people know that, but they didn't have this direct, clear information directly from a prophet. So that's going forward. Although Abraham, Moses, and Aaron, to some degree, had been called prophets, none of them had a fully focused prophetic ministry. So they were prophets to some degree, just like in Deuteronomy 18:15, it says, "There shall arise up unto you a prophet like unto Moses." But this is a different kind of prophet. Like, this is his whole gig all the time. Like, he wasn't just, leading the people and doing this and doing that. Like, his full thing was he was a prophet. He was also a judge, which we'll get to later. But read 1 Samuel 3:19 through 21, please. Sorry, I can't hear you. Do you have the red light on the microphone?
I do now.
All right, thank you.
And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again to Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord.
Okay. So Samuel grew. The Lord was with him. When he spoke something, it came to pass. That's what it means by he didn't let any of his words fall to the ground. And so everyone knew Samuel is God's prophet. It wasn't in question. All the way from the top to the bottom, everybody knew. And it said the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh. Now, we get this prophet that's coming up. We realize everyone knows who he is now. But then we see God is going to judge these sons of Eli. That comes in the section that is called the loss of the ark. So the Philistines stood against the Israelites, and Hophni and Phinehas walked out with the army carrying the ark. And after they were slain, the ark was taken to the Philistines' land of proof, essentially, that their God was better. If you're not familiar with this, this is the concept. If my group beats your group in battle, my God is stronger than your God. And that's what they thought. So when they beat the Israelites in this, they took the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence is supposed to be, and brought it essentially into their God's temple as kind of a trophy. See, we beat you. By the way, not a good plan. Upon hearing this news of his son's death and the ark being stolen, Eli fell out of his seat and fell and broke his neck. If you want to really get technical in this, he was 98 years old, and the Bible says he was heavy. So he fell back, broke his neck. So he died. And then Phinehas' wife in that time was in labor, and she starts to die. And she has a baby, and she names the baby Ichabod, which means no glory. The glory of God was supposed to be around the ark. That was the essentially the idea of this is where God's presence resides. This is God going with us into battle. This is God being with us on the day-to-day. And so when the ark was gone, now they're like, well, what do we do? God's not with us anymore. Is a terrifying moment for them. Read 1 Samuel 4:22.
And she said, the glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken.
Okay, so see those connections. That matters. The Philistines put the ark of God into the house of their gods, and Yahweh begins knocking over the statues of their highest deity, Dagon. So they bring the ark in, and every time they walk away, they come back, and the statues are knocked over. And they're like, well, what's going on? They come back the next day, the statue's knocked over. They come back the second day, technically, and what they find is not only is their statue knocked over, but his hands and head are cut off. And so this was a really interesting time for them, because they're like, what is going on? What is happening to our gods? And God then curses the people with emerods. And if you don't know what that is, feel free to look that up in your own time. Not a good moment. They get cursed, the Philistines, in an attempt to come out from under the curse of Yahweh, because they're realizing all of this started when we brought the Ark of the Covenant into the house of our gods, when we stole it from the Israelites, and they realized this was not a good plan. The Philistines then, in an attempt to come out from under this curse, send it back to Israel on a cart. And they had made a superstitious habit in this point of jumping over the threshold of the door. The ark ended up being in, I think it was Kirjath Jearim, if I remember right. But just a specific city of the Israelites. And that was one of the ways the Philistines wanted to test if this was really Yahweh doing this. They said, we're just going to put some animals on this cart, and we're going to let the cart go and see where it ends up. If it ends up in an Israelite city, then it was definitely their God that did this to us. And it does. So look at God working even through animals. But they started to jump over the threshold as they would go in. These Philistines did. And so all I can think of is if you step on the crack, you break your God's back. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. Doesn't sound like you did, but that's okay. Then we see Samuel as a judge. So Samuel is set apart. He then helps the people, because the Philistines are coming back in. They're coming to attack. They're breaking in. They're like grabbing the edges of the Israelite lands. And so Samuel basically went to the people and said, hey, we have the ark back. This was a length of time, by the way. We have the ark back. You guys need to get rid of your false gods. You need to get right with the Lord, because the reason that the ark went out initially is because the people in Israel were doing wrong things, especially the priests, but they were not the only ones. And so the people give up their false gods, and so he tells them, all right, everybody come to Mizpah, give up your false gods, and then go fight the Philistines. And they do. And when they do, they win. They beat the Philistines off their land. They receive back what they had lost, and then Samuel becomes a judge in Israel for the rest of his life. Kind of makes me think, we talked last week how there were 12 judges. Well, there were 12 disciples too. And then you had one that kind of came out in the middle of nowhere. And we always talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. How many are there really? There's 13. Because ultimately, even though there's 12 sons, one son had 2 kids that get counted in the lineage. And so a lot of times when there's 12, there's really 13. And here's another scenario where you've got 12 of these judges, but then comes the 13th one. And he was then the last one. He thought about trying to make his kids judges. His sons were also wicked men, so he apparently did not learn from Eli how to be a good father, what not to do. And so his kids ended up being wicked too. They were people who would take bribes. They were people who basically did whatever they wanted to get ahead. And so the people were like, look, we won't have them as our judges. We're not doing it. Give us a king. We want a king. And that's the next section. The Israelites request a king. the Israelites' request for a king is not inherently wrong. I want to put that out first. If you walk through the first 5 books of the Bible, what you'll see is God told Abraham he would have kings come from his line. God, in Genesis 49, said that the rulers will come through Judah. If you look at, which by the way, up till this point, they really haven't. If you think about who's been in charge, it's been Levites, it's been random judges from different areas, and so now they ask for a king, which could be from the tribe of Judah, if they really wanted it to. So Jacob talked about this. Balaam talked about how someone from the tribe of Judah would be ruling over not only Israel, but the other surrounding nations. And even the law informed the people that a king was to come. Why in the world would you have laws about what a king should or shouldn't do if there's no chance that you should ever have a king? Think about that. Deuteronomy 17, we talked about it. It had 3 prohibitions for kings. Don't love money, don't try to gain to yourself chariots, and don't multiply wives. Those were the 3 rules that were given to kings. And they were also told they should make their own copy of the scriptures, not like their own, but like they should write it themselves and study it, so they're well learned in what God would have them to do. So that said, the request for a king is not inherently wrong. So what I want you to do is I want you to see what may make their request wrong when we read this section. So read 1 Samuel 8, 5 through 7, please.
And said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Pause real quick. What did they want to be like? Like all the nations. What does God not want them to be like?
All the nations.
Like all the nations. Now, why is this offensive to Samuel? Samuel does not like this. You're going to get that as our friend keeps reading.
But the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.
Ooh, and we talked about this in the time of the judges. At that time, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, the Bible's very clear. The king of the Israelites ought to be who? God. But they didn't view God as their king. They wanted a physical king. They wanted a military leader to go out and raw them into battle. And they wanted someone that would make them just like the nations around them. They haven't enjoyed being a theocracy. It was not their favorite thing. Which, to be fair, sometimes it was pretty messed up. But they say, you know what? We want a king. Give us something so we can be like the other nations. And God says, give it to them because it's me they're rejecting, not you. So God grants the request to the people, but he has Samuel warn them about what this would mean. He said, if you do this, they're going to take taxes. Man, I'm blaming them already. All right, they said they're going to conscript your young men and your young women. They're going to bring them in as maids or as servants or as warriors. They're going to become servants for the king. They will take your lands and your animals at a whim. And the people all said, yep, sounds good, give us a king. We're in. They don't really second guess things. They just say, we're going to do it. First thought, going for it. Not a good plan. Not a good plan. Samuel then meets Saul through what would seem like an unplanned turn of events. Saul lost some sheep and went to Samuel to find out where they had gone. In this interaction, Samuel tells Saul that he will be king. And Saul's like, what are you talking about? I am from the smallest tribe, Benjamin, which if you're not really sure on why they're the smallest tribe, all the other tribes beat up on them at the end of the book of Judges because they, acted like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so, there's not that many Benjamites. And he says, look, I'm from an unknown family out of a small tribe. Why do you guys care? Why should I be the king? So it's really weird when you think of Saul, because we know stories about Saul. That seems way too humble to be the Saul that we think about. Isn't it worth noting that you don't have to start with pride to have pride? It can kind of come in along the way. We must always be looking and seeing what's in us. A king after the heart of men. This is Saul. I have to get moving. I'm running behind. Saul is introduced as the first coming king. Samuel then anoints Saul as the coming king, to which Saul is very hesitant. He actually hides behind things when they try to call him out to come be king. He does not want to be there, which is really hard because this guy is a giant. It says he is like head and shoulders above all the other people. So like imagine, I don't know, who's really short? Tim Priva. All right, I heard someone say it. She said it, not me. All right, imagine like Bob Lyons standing next to Tim Priva. Like it's just, you can tell there's a difference. Like there's some height there. And so Saul looks like he would be the choice if you want a warrior king to come in and terrify your enemies, because he's huge. Dude's a giant. So Saul is introduced as their potential king. The people chose him. They decided he would be good for the most part due to his size, although there were some dissenters. And there were no monarchies up till this time in this group. So they don't have like a big palace and all these things. So after Saul gets crowned king, you know what he does? He goes home. He goes home, goes back to his life. The next time you see Saul, he's plowing a field. Again, this doesn't seem like this grandiose psycho king that you see at the latter part of the book. He seems really humble. And the Spirit of God came upon... I skipped something. Forgive me. So I want you to see that although there are dissenters, Saul does unify the people into one kingdom due to battle. The Ammonites come and attack Israel, hearing of a new leader. They thought maybe with someone new coming in with some dissension about whether or not he should be the leader, maybe now would be a good time to attack them. Maybe now when they're kind of divided on who should be in charge, now's a good time to go after them. And Saul was informed of this while he's out plowing his field. And the Bible says the Spirit of God came upon Saul and his anger was kindled. Read 1 Samuel 11:7, please.
And he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces and sent them throughout all the coasts of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, Whosoever comes not forth after Saul and after Samuel shall be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent.
All right, so he said, either you come out and you help me defend our people, or I'm going to slaughter all your animals. And they said, we're coming. They're like, that is a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of time. Please don't take my stuff. And so in that, Saul defeats the Ammonites, and the people then were ready to support Saul as king wholly. Samuel reminds the people of their history, that they had a tendency to become unfaithful towards the Lord, regardless of who is in charge of them. And he tells them, look, if you sin and turn to idols, not even a king will save you. Just because you have a king like the nations doesn't mean you're going to be okay if you turn from your true king. You will not be. Then I want you to see that Saul sins against the Lord. This is the next big thing. Saul essentially has three major sins against the Lord, and eventually has many times where he tries to destroy or go against exactly what he knows God has planned. So Saul is supposed to wait for Samuel in a battle that's come up with the Philistines so that Samuel can do a sacrifice before the Lord, because again, Samuel's a Levite and does sacrifices. So Saul, however, gets impatient and scared due to the enemy, and he decides, I'm just going to do the sacrifice myself. We'll get God on our side, we'll do what we're supposed to do, and then we'll go beat him up. And whenever you rush God, it does not normally go well. If you try to do something before God's timing, generally you'll find we flail. Now, what happens is right after he does this, Samuel shows up. You're like, man, you couldn't have done this like 10 minutes ago? Well, this act removes Saul's family from having a dynastic throne. He said, look, because you've done this, you won't have a bunch of sons that sit on the throne. This will not be your throne forever. which, by the way, it couldn't have been because he's not from the line of Judah. But this is what removed him on his own basis. And so the next thing Saul does is Saul is told to destroy a wicked city and its king, some Amalekites. And instead of doing this, he takes the king captive and he takes the cattle to sacrifice unto the Lord. Not a good plan. God says, do this. You say, almost. So what happens when God tells you to utterly destroy something, to die to it, to get it out of your life, and instead of doing that, we just kind of bind it up. We just kind of push it back a little bit. We just kind of, try to mold it into a smaller hole. Is that what God told us to do?
Nope.
No. And does it come back to bite us?
Usually.
Yes. Yes, it does. And so I want you to see this. God gives some really important information. In this, we see that in this sin, God told Saul that God would seek a new king and that the kingdom would be taken from him personally. So he said, not only are you not going to have sons that reign, now you're not even going to stay king. Like, it's going to be taken from you and given to someone else. Now, Samuel here gives us a very important thing to understand about God. If someone could read 1 Samuel 15, 22 and 23, and then after that, I think I'll have to do the reading for sake of time.
And Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For the rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king.
Now, after this statement, Saul desires less to be right with God and more to be seen as legitimate in the sight of the people. If you're familiar with this, he says, hey, bless me in front of these people. I know what I did was wrong. I get it. Don't let the people basically see that I'm not on God's side. Like, try to like lift me up a little bit here. And it shows you where his heart really is. Finally, Saul, in a worried state at the end of his life, seeks out a witch, the witch of Endor, to bring Samuel back from the dead, not Saul, to bring Samuel back from the dead for some advice. Much to the witch's surprise, this actually works. People have questions about that. I would say God intended for it to work at this one time to give Saul his final condemnation. And then he's given the truth that in the next battle, him and his sons will be killed. Witchcraft is obviously condemned in the law, and it's noted to be worthy of death. We can't seek surety for the future at the cost of personal holiness. So this is the final straw, and it happens to be at the end of what many people assume to be approximately a 40-year reign of King Saul. So God prepares then a different king to come in Saul's place. This is a man after God's own heart. Does anyone know who that is? David. Then you're probably familiar with 1 Samuel 16:7, which it says, But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I refused him, talking about one of David's brothers. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. You see, the king will come from the highly professed, the attested to kingly line, that of Judah. He will, however, be the youngest member of the family of Jesse, a shepherd boy named David. Samuel, at this point, anoints David king. He does it with oil. Just in case you're not familiar with that, the same way the priests, the high priest, those people are anointed with oil. The kings were anointed with oil, and it was a picture of God's Spirit coming upon them. So we don't have that in day-to-day now. Like, we don't picture God's Spirit coming upon you in that way. Instead, we get baptized with the Spirit. So something to know. But they would be anointed with oil. But he doesn't take over the kingdom for several years. Seemingly, right as God anoints David with oil, the Spirit of God comes upon David and leaves Saul. Instead, God troubles Saul with a different spirit, and his servants, after some time, decide that Saul needs a gifted harp player to soothe his spirit. Who, oh who, could they find a gifted harp player in? David. It is David. So David gets brought in. Then answered one of his servants and said, Behold, I have a son, Jesse, a Bethlehemite, that is a cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. And verse 21 says, And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, he became his armor bearer. Now David is grown to be loved by the people. David works with Saul, but he also goes back to tend his sheep. If you're familiar with the story, he's back with the sheep when the story of Goliath comes about. They're out to war with the Philistines, and Saul with his mighty men are out in array in battle, and the Philistine Goliath comes out. He's a giant of a man. Just look up how much his armor and spear and things weigh, if you want to look at that any. But he goes out and he talks about, being a champion. If you've ever seen a movie that I'm not suggesting you see, but maybe you did, if you ever saw the movie Achilles, they go through and they begin the movie with champions, and one's like, Boagrius! And the other guy's like, Achilles! And then Achilles comes in and murks him in half a minute. It's intense. But no one is willing to fight this Philistine. Everyone is afraid. And so David, upon the request of his father, goes out to check on the battle, to bring gifts to people, and David hears that whoever defeats Goliath will be greatly blessed. They will get riches, their family will be free in Israel, and they will get to marry one of the king's daughters. David says, Amen, let's go. David, I don't know if you realize this, has a problem with women. If you haven't realized it yet, you will figure this out. And so David has been uniquely qualified to fight Goliath, though. He's been trained to be fearless in the fighting of both a bear and a lion. He sought to defeat Goliath first and foremost to honor God, because he felt like Goliath was dishonoring God. He had the Spirit of God upon him, and David came against Goliath in a very unconventional way. He didn't just put on Saul's armor and sword and say, all right, let me go fight Goliath. Instead, he said, nah, I don't need any of that. He went and got 5 stones out of the creek and a sling, and he went and he fought Goliath his way. After defeating Goliath, by the way, he lodges a stone in his forehead and then uses Goliath's sword to lop off his head, in case anyone missed that in the Sunday school version. So after doing this, after defeating Goliath, David behaves himself very wisely before the king. He actually becomes a leader in Saul's army, becomes very respectable. Eventually, people begin to attribute greater feats to David than they do to Saul. They start to say things like, Saul has slayed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Saul's pride then overtakes him. He starts to get really mad at David, and for a few years, off and on, he attempts to kill David. Just at random. Sometimes they're fine, and then the next minute he's throwing a javelin into the wall to smite him to the wall. Think your work environment is toxic. Anyway, he attempts this through his actions of piercing him to the wall with a javelin. He chases him all over the country. He attempts this by putting David in seemingly difficult battles. He once told him, he said, hey, I'll let you marry my daughter if you bring me 100 Philistine foreskins. If you don't know what that is, don't ask. And David, upon hearing that, said, I'll marry your daughter. I'll bring you 200. And he does. Again, it's weird, don't ask. And so David is running from King Saul, but he has faithful few that are willing to help him. 1, Saul's daughter Michal, who he's married to. 2, Saul's son Jonathan, who is his best friend. Perfect picture of friendship in the Bible is David and Jonathan. It's awesome to look at if you have time. A few hundred soldiers that end up joining David through the time he's running away from King Saul. And even the Philistines, which seems really weird. At different times, David goes and lives with the Philistines. And they are happy to have him there. They're like, David, you're great. We love you. Except, one of them is. The rest of them are like, we don't really trust this guy. And they were probably better off to not trust him. Anyway, so throughout this, David does not falter in his love and care for the king. David refuses to lift a hand against Saul, even though he has the opportunity 2 times to kill King Saul, because David is already the rightful king. Saul is wrongfully trying to kill him. David has the opportunity, and he doesn't do it. Because David, 1, cares for Saul, and 2, doesn't want to harm God's anointed. David eventually travels to stay with the Philistines to hide from Saul, and what you'll find out is, as we talked about earlier, Saul in his last battle dies with his sons. He ends up getting to a point where he's mortally wounded and kills himself, if you're not familiar with that story. So that brings in the end of Saul, and for the most part, the end of his line. You'll hear a little bit about next week, where we talk about a little bit more of Saul's family. And then David coming in to be the rightful king. So theophanies, prophecies, types of Christ. This is very short. David, a king from Judah after God's own heart, like Jesus would be. David slaying Goliath is a picture of Christ defeating Satan. I've heard a really great analogy between the fight with Goliath and the 40 days in the wilderness. David gathered 5 stones. He used one. God used the Pentateuch, picked one book. He quoted Deuteronomy only. Goliath is a picture of Satan. And so you get this beautiful image. Oh, by the way, there's a 40-day time period on both of these, where after 40 days, then David comes in. After 40 days, you see Satan come in, and Jesus beats him. There's a lot of really cool things there if you want to look at it ever. And then God promised a continued Davidic line. So, in conclusion, Christians, we must be careful to obey God, even when it doesn't make the most sense logically that we can think about. We must trust God and his process for everything. We may find God is orchestrating the world around us to be what we need when we need to be it. The world will come against us, but in the words of David, be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me, for my soul trusteth in thee. Yea, in the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge until these calamities be overpast. That is our lesson for today. We're going to pray and close out. Dear God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the ability to get into it. Pray that we would maybe garner some lessons from the life of Samuel, from the life of Saul, and from the life of David, and that we can come to know your word, live it out, and seek you in it. In Christ's name, amen.